Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Or if you're stumbling in here for the first time, bewildered and probably a little sleep-deprived, hey. Tonight, we're ditching the usual battlefields and imperial scandals for something a little holier. Well, holier on paper anyway. The title might say, Boring History for Sleep. And, yeah, the idea of ancient Roman religion might conjure images of dusty tomes and impenetrable rituals. But trust me, beneath the incense smoke and the solemn pronouncements, there's a whole universe of human frustration, political maneuvering, and frankly, deeply unglamorous work. We're diving into why it seriously, profoundly sucked to be a priest in ancient Rome. Forget the serene, wise, holy man image Hollywood might have sold you, communing with the gods in a sun-dappled temple. The reality for many Roman priests was less divine ecstasy and more cosmic bureaucracy, often with a side of public pressure, bizarre restrictions, and an alarming amount of animal entrails. This isn't about faith, it's about the job description, and let me tell you, it was a doozy. So, if you enjoy peeling back the veneer of history to find the sticky, uncomfortable truths underneath, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're feeling particularly masochistic and enjoy these descents into the less than sparkling bits of the past, consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, no pressure. As always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your end. Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see this global congregation of historical insomniacs. Now, dim the lights. Maybe get that fan going for a bit of white noise, that soft background hum of impending historical disillusionment, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the sacred and often sucky world of Roman priesthood. So, you've decided on a career change. Gladiatoring looks a bit too stabby. Politics seems like a nest of vipers, though, spoiler, you're not escaping that here. And merchant shipping means a high chance of drowning or being captured by pirates. What's left for an ambitious Roman with a desire for a bit of public standing, maybe some influence, and hopefully a steady gig? Priesthood sounds respectable, right? You envision yourself draped in immaculate white robes, leading solemn processions, uttering profound pronouncements that shape the fate of the city. You'll be revered, wise, a direct line to the gods. People will hang on your every word, seek your guidance, maybe even offer you the choicest cuts from the sacrifices. Congratulations. You've just signed up for a life that could be anything from mind-numbingly tedious to politically perilous, often involving bizarre personal restrictions that would make a modern monk look like a party animal, and a disturbingly intimate acquaintance with the internal organs of various farm animals. The first thing you need to understand is that Roman priest wasn't a one-size-fits-all job. There wasn't a single unified Roman church with a clear hierarchy like you might imagine. Instead, Roman religion was a vast, sprawling, often bewildering collection of different priesthoods, cults, and rituals, each dedicated to specific deities or aspects of the divine. You had the major colleges of priests, like the pontiffs, the augurs, the quindecimviri sacris faciundis, try saying that 5 times fast after a few cups of Roman wine, and the epulones. Then there were individual flamens, priests dedicated to specific gods, the flamen dialis, Jupiter's priest, being the most famous and, as we'll see, the most ridiculously hamstrung by rules. You had the Vestal Virgins, a unique and highly revered female priesthood, and then countless other smaller, local, or specialized priestly roles. Getting one of these gigs wasn't usually about a burning spiritual calling or a profound theological insight. More often, it was about your family connections, your social standing, your political ambitions, or your ability to pay for the honor. Many priesthoods, especially the prestigious ones, were held by members of the senatorial elite, often as part of a typical career path, cursus honorum. Being a pontifex or an augur added to your dignitas, your public prestige. It was a good CV builder. Sure, you had to perform certain religious duties, but the role was as much about status and influence as it was about piety. And for some of the less glamorous, more obscure priesthoods, well, someone had to do it. Maybe your family had traditionally held that role, or maybe it was the only priestly office you could get. So, your calling might be less a whisper from Jupiter, and more a nudge from your ambitious father, or a hefty donation to the right people. The public image was crucial. You had to look the part. You had to project an aura of solemnity and ritual purity, even if you'd just come from a raucous political debate or a less than pious private dinner party. Any public misstep, any perceived impiety, could reflect badly not just on you, but on the state itself, because Roman religion was deeply intertwined with the well-being of Rome. So, no pressure. Just maintain an impeccable public facade while navigating a complex web of duties you might not fully understand or even believe in, all for the glory of Rome and maybe your own career. Welcome to the sacred grind. Let's talk about the daily grind, the bread and butter, or rather, the incense and sacrificial animal of your priestly existence, the rituals. Oh, the endless, intricate, mind-numbingly repetitive rituals. If you thought your office job with its endless TPS reports was soul-destroying, imagine having to perform complex, archaic ceremonies where a single misspoken word, a stumble, a sneeze at the wrong moment, or even an ill-omened bird flying overhead could invalidate the entire thing and potentially incur divine wrath. The Romans were obsessed with Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. This wasn't about warm, fuzzy feelings, it was a contractual relationship. The gods protected Rome, and in return, Rome performed the correct rituals, offered the correct sacrifices, and generally kept the divine powers happy. It was your job, as a priest, to be the middleman in this cosmic contract negotiation, and the fine print was a killer. First, there was the calendar. The Roman calendar was a labyrinth of fasti, days when public business could be conducted, nefasti, days when it couldn't, and comitiales, days when assemblies could meet, all punctuated by an overwhelming number of religious festivals, sacrifices, and observances. There were hundreds of festivals throughout the year, dedicated to a bewildering array of major and minor deities. Each one had its specific rites, its prescribed offerings, its unique prayers and formulas that had to be recited perfectly. Many of these prayers were in archaic Latin, so old that even the priests themselves might not have fully understood the meaning of every word. But meaning wasn't always the point. Correct recitation was. Think of it like reciting a complex legal document in a dead language, knowing that a misplaced comma could bring down famine or plague. The pressure was immense. You'd have to memorize vast quantities of this stuff. No teleprompters, no handy prayer books for many of these ancient rites. It was all up here in your head. And if your mind went blank, or if you coughed, or if a dog barked at an inopportune moment, the whole ritual might have to be repeated, instauratio. Sometimes, multiple times, until it was deemed perfect. Imagine the frustration, the sheer boredom of repeating the same elaborate, hour-long ceremony 3 or 4 times because a pigeon decided to poop on the altar at the critical moment. And then there was augury, the practice of interpreting divine will through omens, particularly the flight and behavior of birds. If you were an augur, part of your job involved sitting for hours, sometimes all night, in a designated sacred spot, templum, meticulously observing the sky. Which birds appeared? From what direction? What sounds did they make? It was a complex system of interpretation, and the fate of important state decisions, battles, elections, treaties, could hang on your reading of these avian signs. Sounds exciting? Imagine staring at an empty sky for 6 hours, trying to stay awake, knowing that the future of Rome depends on whether a crow caws on your left or your right. The tedium would be incredible. And if you got it wrong, or if your interpretation didn't align with what the powerful politicians wanted to hear, well, that could lead to a whole other set of problems we'll get to later. This wasn't a job for the easily distracted or the creatively inclined. Innovation was frowned upon. Tradition and exact repetition were paramount. It was a world of meticulous, often stultifying, adherence to ancient forms, a constant battle against human error and ill-timed natural phenomena, all performed under the public gaze and with the weight of the state's well-being on your shoulders. Sleep-inducing for us to read about? Imagine having to live it. Beyond the tedium of ritual, many priesthoods came with a truly astonishing list of personal sacrifices, restrictions, and downright bizarre taboos that governed nearly every aspect of your daily life. You think your vegan friend has a complicated diet? You haven't met the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter. This guy was the poster child for priestly inconvenience. His life was a walking, talking encyclopedia of don'ts. He couldn't ride a horse. He couldn't even touch a horse. He couldn't touch or even name a dog, a she-goat, ivy, beans, or raw meat. He couldn't anoint his body outdoors. His hair and nails could only be cut by a free man, and the clippings had to be buried under a fruitful tree. He couldn't wear a ring unless it was broken. He couldn't have a knot anywhere on his clothing. His special conical hat, the apex, had to be worn at all times, even indoors. He couldn't be away from his own bed for more than 3 consecutive nights, which pretty much ruled out any exciting away missions or even a long weekend at his country villa. He couldn't see people working. His wife, the Flaminica Dialis, had her own set of equally inconvenient restrictions. Why all these rules? They were ancient, their original meanings often lost to time, but they were believed to be essential for maintaining his ritual purity and his connection to Jupiter. Imagine trying to live a normal life under such conditions. Every day would be a minefield of potential ritual contamination. Oops, is that a bean? Must avert my gaze. Sorry, can't come to your cavalry parade, allergic to horses, metaphorically speaking. It sounds almost comical, but for the Flamen Dialis it was deadly serious. Breaking these taboos could mean losing his priesthood, or worse, being seen as having endangered the state. And it wasn't just him. Other Flamens had their own specific, though usually less extensive, sets of rules. The Vestal virgins, while highly honoured, lived under an incredibly strict vow of celibacy for 30 years. If a Vestal was found to have broken her vow and lost her virginity, the punishment was horrific. She was buried alive. Her male lover, if he could be found, was flogged to death in public. Talk about pressure to remain pure. Other priests might have had to abstain from certain foods before performing rites, or observe periods of chastity. Some priesthoods might have required specific, uncomfortable forms of dress, or restricted who you could associate with. You couldn't just be a priest on festival days. These rules often permeated your entire existence, turning your life into a carefully choreographed performance of ritual purity. It was a constant state of vigilance, a life lived under a microscope, where the mundane actions of daily life, eating, sleeping, dressing, were freighted with religious significance and potential peril. Forget personal freedom or spontaneity. Your life was largely dictated by ancient, often inexplicable regulations. It's less a calling and more a meticulously scripted, lifelong exercise in self-denial and adherence to baffling protocols. Fun times. Now, if you're picturing Roman priesthood as all solemn prayers and wafting incense, you might want to adjust that mental image to include a significant amount of blood, guts, and general gore. Animal sacrifice was a cornerstone of Roman religious practice, a central act in maintaining that crucial pax deorum. And as a priest, you weren't just an observer. You were often a key participant in what was, essentially, a ritualized slaughter. This wasn't a neat, tidy affair conducted behind closed doors by specialized butchers, while assistants, victimari, often did the actual killing blow. The priest was front and center, overseeing the entire process, consecrating the animal, and, in many cases, performing or supervising the extispicium, the inspection of the entrails, particularly the liver, for omens. So, let's walk through this. You've got your sacrificial animal, a pig, a sheep, an ox, depending on the god and the occasion. It has to be perfect, unblemished. It's led to the altar, often decorated with ribbons. Prayers are said. Then, the animal is stunned, its throat cut. Blood gushes forth, spattering the altar, the ground, and quite possibly your pristine priestly robes. The smell of fresh blood, mixed with incense and the general aroma of a crowd, would be potent. Once the animal is dead, it's butchered. Certain organs, particularly the liver, lungs and heart, the exter, were considered vital for divination. As a priest, especially if you were a haruspex, an Etruscan-influenced diviner specializing in entrails, you'd be the one carefully examining these still warm, bloody organs. You're looking for abnormalities, unusual markings, discolorations, anything that could be interpreted as a sign from the gods. Is the liver a healthy color? Is it abnormally large or small? Are there any strange growths or lesions? Imagine holding a steaming sheep's liver in your hands, trying to decipher cosmic messages from its lobes and fissures, while a crowd anxiously awaits your pronouncement. It required a strong stomach and a certain detachment from the inherent messiness of it all. And what if the omens were bad? If the liver looked diseased or misshapen? That was a serious problem. It could mean the gods were displeased that the proposed action, a battle, an election, should be abandoned or postponed. The pressure to read the entrails correctly and to deliver a verdict that was both ritually sound and politically palatable was immense. After the inspection, parts of the animal were burned on the altar as an offering to the gods. The rest? Often, it was cooked and consumed in a communal feast. So, 1 minute you're elbow deep in animal viscera, the next you're carving up the roast. It was a cycle of life, death, and consumption, all wrapped up in sacred ritual. But let's not romanticize it. It was bloody, smelly, and often messy work. Priests had to be comfortable with the visceral realities of animal slaughter. They weren't just theologians, they were, in a very practical sense, participants in a sacred butchery. Not exactly the serene, contemplative image most people have of a holy man, is it? More like a cross between a high priest and a very specialized, fortune-telling butcher. Hope you weren't squeamish, because this was a regular, unavoidable part of the job description. So, you're putting up with the endless rules, the mind-numbing rituals, and the occasional gore-fest. Surely the pay must be good, right? A prestigious priesthood must come with a hefty salary, a nice temple-side villa, and maybe a chariot with gold hubcaps. Well, not necessarily. The financial realities of being a Roman priest were as varied and complex as the priesthoods themselves, and it wasn't always a ticket to easy street. In fact, for some, it could be a significant financial drain. Some of the major priesthoods, particularly those connected to wealthy temples or those that came with landed estates, temple lands could be extensive and generate considerable income, were indeed lucrative. The Pontifex Maximus, the head of the state religion, wielded enormous influence and controlled significant religious funds. Certain cults, especially popular ones, or those with wealthy patrons, could bring in substantial offerings and donations. But access to these top-tier, money-making priesthoods was usually restricted to the very wealthy and politically powerful elite. They were often seen as plums to be handed out to favored individuals. For many other priestly roles, however, there wasn't a set salary. Your income might come from a share of the sacrificial offerings, though the gods got their portion first. and often the best bits were reserved for public feasts or specific temple personnel, or from fees paid for performing certain rites. This could be inconsistent and unreliable. Furthermore, some priesthoods actually cost money to hold. Aspiring to a priesthood, or being elected to one, often involved significant personal expenditure. You might be expected to fund public sacrifices, games, or feasts out of your own pocket to celebrate your appointment or to honor the god you served. This was a way of displaying your piety and generosity, and your wealth, but it could be a serious burden, especially if your personal finances weren't robust. Think of it as an unpaid internship with extremely high public visibility and a requirement to throw lavish parties for the entire neighborhood. The pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle, to appear dignified and prosperous, could also be costly. You needed the right robes, the right attendants, the right kind of residence if you were a prominent priest. And then there was the potential for corruption, which cut both ways. A priest in control of temple funds or valuable offerings might be tempted to siphon some off for personal use. The line between legitimate temple administration and embezzlement could be blurry, and oversight wasn't always rigorous. Conversely, individuals seeking divine favor or a favorable omen might try to bribe a priest. Here, Flamen Scribonius, a little something for your trouble, and perhaps Jupiter could see his way to making my upcoming shipping venture a success. This kind of thing undoubtedly happened, adding another layer of moral complexity or opportunity, depending on your perspective, to the priestly role. So, while some priests lived very comfortably indeed, many others found that their sacred duties were a drain on their resources, or offered only a meager and uncertain livelihood. It wasn't a guaranteed path to riches. For some, it was more about the prestige, the political advantage, or perhaps even a genuine sense of duty than it was about the money. But you can bet that the bills for all that sacrificial wine and those perfect, unblemished oxen still had to be paid, and it wasn't always the temple treasury footing the bill. Now, if you thought you could just retreat into your temple and focus on communing with the gods, blissfully separate from the messy world of Roman politics, you are hilariously, tragically mistaken. In Rome, religion and politics weren't just intertwined. They were practically fused at the hip, engaged in a complex, often codependent, and sometimes dangerously dysfunctional dance. Many of the most important priesthoods were held by active politicians. The office of Pontifex Maximus, for example, the chief priest of Rome, was a highly coveted political prize, eventually becoming one of the titles held by the emperors themselves. Holding a major priesthood gave a politician immense prestige, auctoritas, influence over the religious calendar, which could be manipulated to help or hinder political proceedings, and a say in matters of sacred law, which often had real-world implications. So, as a priest, especially in one of the higher colleges, you were very much a player in the political game, whether you wanted to be or not. Your interpretations of omens, your pronouncements on religious matters, your scheduling of festivals, all of these could have significant political consequences, and you would be under immense pressure to ensure they aligned with the interests of your political faction or powerful patrons. Imagine you're an augur, and a consul who happens to be your political enemy is about to propose a crucial piece of legislation. Suddenly, you observe some very unfavorable bird signs. Sorry, consul, looks like Jupiter's not keen on your law today. Maybe try again next month, or never. Conversely, if your ally was launching a military campaign, you'd be expected to find auspicious omens, even if the chickens weren't particularly cooperative that morning. Yes, sacred chickens, the Polarii, and how they ate, was another form of divination. This made priests powerful, but it also made them vulnerable. If your political faction fell out of favor, or if a new emperor with different allegiances came to power, your priestly position could be at risk. You might be sidelined, ignored, or even actively persecuted if you were seen as a threat or an obstacle. Accusations of impiety, impietas, or of manipulating religious rites for personal or political gain were serious charges and could have dire consequences, including exile or even death, especially during periods of intense political turmoil like the late Republic. The gods themselves could become political footballs. Ambitious politicians might promote the cult of a particular deity to bolster their own image or to appeal to a certain segment of the population. Temples could become centers of political intrigue, places where alliances were forged and plots were hatched under the guise of religious observance. As a priest, you might find yourself caught in the middle of these power struggles, forced to choose sides, or trying desperately to remain neutral in a system where neutrality was often impossible. Your sacred duties could be co-opted for profane ends, and your religious authority manipulated to serve worldly ambitions. It was a dangerous game, where a misstep could not only offend the gods, but also incur the wrath of very powerful and very human enemies. So much for a quiet life of prayer and contemplation. Your temple might be less a sanctuary and more a viper's nest, and your priestly robes might offer little protection from the sharp knives of Roman politics. Beyond the overt political dangers, there was the crushing weight of responsibility and the relentless glare of public scrutiny. As a priest in Rome, you weren't just performing rituals for your own spiritual fulfillment. You were a public servant, responsible for maintaining the Pax Deorum on behalf of the entire community, indeed, the entire state. And if things went wrong, if there was a famine, a plague, a military defeat, or any other major calamity, who do you think was often looked to for an explanation, or even for a scapegoat? That's right, you and your priestly colleagues. If a ritual was performed incorrectly, or if an omen was misinterpreted or ignored, it was believed that the gods could withdraw their favor, leading to disaster. The public had high expectations. They expected you to get it right, to ensure divine goodwill, to deliver favorable prophecies, and generally to keep the cosmos in good working order. No pressure then. Imagine the anxiety. Every sacrifice, every prayer, every augural observation carried this immense burden. If the entrails looked bad, or if the sacred chickens refused to eat, a terrible omen, you were the one who had to deliver the bad news, knowing that it could cause public panic or anger. And if you delivered good omens, and then things went disastrously wrong anyway, well, clearly, you must have messed up. Maybe you weren't pure enough. Maybe you missed a crucial detail in the ritual. Maybe you were secretly in league with malevolent forces. The public could be fickle, and in times of crisis, they needed someone to blame. Priests, as the intermediaries with the divine, were obvious targets. This was especially true for those in highly visible and specialized roles. Consider the Vestal Virgins again. Their primary duty was to tend the sacred flame of Vesta in her temple, a flame that was believed to be linked to the safety and continuity of Rome itself. If that flame ever went out, it was considered a catastrophic omen. And if a Vestal was found to have violated her vow of chastity, as we mentioned, the punishment was horrific, being buried alive, because her impurity was thought to pollute the entire state and endanger its relationship with the gods. The psychological toll of such responsibility must have been immense. You were living under a constant microscope, your every action, your every word, potentially subject to interpretation and criticism. There was no room for error, no allowance for human fallibility. The gods demanded perfection, and the public expected you to deliver it. This wasn't just about fear of divine retribution. It was about fear of public disgrace, loss of status, and potentially severe punishment. And if you were a priest who genuinely believed in the efficacy of these rites, the weight of that responsibility would be even heavier. You would truly feel that the fate of Rome rested in part, on your shoulders, on your ability to perform your duties flawlessly. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry, especially when your toolkit consists mainly of ancient prayers, sacrificial knives, and the unpredictable behavior of birds and animal livers. Now, not every priest in Rome got to hang out with Jupiter or Mars, the big-name celebrities of the Olympian pantheon. For every prestigious Flamen Dialis or influential pontifex, there were countless other priests serving less glamorous, more obscure deities, or tending to the religious needs of smaller, local communities. Imagine being the priest of, say, Robigus, the god of wheat rust, or Cloacina, the goddess of the Roman sewer system. Yes, these were actual Roman deities, among hundreds, even thousands of others. While Jupiter got the massive temple on the Capitoline Hill and the grandest sacrifices, your job as priest of, for example, Cardia, the goddess of door hinges, might involve significantly less fanfare and probably a much smaller budget. Your congregation might be a handful of local families, your temple a tiny, overlooked shrine. The rituals might be just as complex and demanding as those for the major gods. But the public recognition, the prestige, and the potential for political influence would be far less. You're still bound by the rules, still responsible for performing the rites correctly, but without the perks of being associated with a A-list god. Then there were the countless local spirits, the noumena believed to inhabit specific places, groves, springs, crossroads. These often had their own little cults, their own local priests or caretakers, responsible for maintaining their shrines and ensuring they received their due offerings. This was religion at its most grassroots level, far removed from the grand state cults of Rome. But it was still work, still a responsibility. You also had priests of foreign cults that had been imported into Rome, like those of Isis or Cybele. While these mystery cults could become very popular, they also sometimes faced suspicion or even persecution from the Roman authorities, especially if their practices were seen as too un-Roman or disruptive to public order. Being a priest in one of these cults could be a risky proposition, potentially putting you at odds with the traditional Roman religious establishment. And let's not forget the sheer mental effort of keeping all these gods straight. The Roman pantheon was vast and ever-expanding. New gods were constantly being adopted or assimilated. Each had its own specific attributes, myths, rituals, and preferred offerings. As a priest, even if you were dedicated to one primary deity, you'd need a working knowledge of the wider divine landscape, especially if you were part of one of the major colleges that oversaw religious law and practice for the entire state. It was a complex theological and ritualistic universe to navigate. So, if you drew the short straw and ended up as the priest of, say, Sterquilinus, the god of fertilizer, really, your daily life might be a bit less awe-inspiring than that of your colleague who got to officiate at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The responsibilities were still there. The need for ritual exactitude was still paramount, but the glory, the influence, and probably the quality of the sacrificial leftovers were likely on a much humbler scale. It's the divine equivalent of being a character actor versus a movie star. Same profession, vastly different experience. One of the most fascinating, and perhaps for the priests themselves, most challenging aspects of their role, especially in the later Republic and during the Empire, must have been the growing undercurrent of intellectual and spiritual doubt. While the state religion, with its emphasis on ritual and contractual obligation, remained the public face of Roman piety, among the educated elite, philosophical skepticism and alternative spiritual ideas were gaining ground. Did all those priests, especially the highly educated ones who were also politicians and scholars, truly believe in the literal efficacy of every arcane ritual they performed? Did they genuinely think that the flight of a bird or the markings on a sheep's liver held the key to the future? It's hard to say for certain, as expressing outright atheism or deep skepticism about the state gods could be dangerous. But Roman literature, from figures like Cicero, Seneca, or Lucretius, certainly reveals a spectrum of belief, from devout adherence to various forms of philosophical deism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, which was atheistic in its implications for divine intervention, or even outright cynicism about traditional religious practices. Imagine being a pontifex, a man of letters and philosophy, meticulously carrying out an ancient sacrifice that you privately suspected was, at best, a symbolic act for maintaining social order, or at worst, a meaningless superstition. The potential for cognitive dissonance would be immense. You're publicly upholding a system that your private intellect might be questioning. You're going through the motions, performing these elaborate, ancient rites with solemn dignity, all while perhaps thinking, is anyone really listening up there? And does it even matter, as long as the populace believes and remains orderly? This isn't to say all priests were secret skeptics. Many undoubtedly held sincere beliefs. But for those who were more philosophically inclined, the priestly role might have involved a degree of internal conflict, a tension between public duty and private conviction. Furthermore, the rise of mystery cults, like those of Isis, Mithras, or Cybele, offered more personal, emotional, and often esoteric forms of religious experience that contrasted sharply with the formal, civic nature of the state religion. These cults often promised salvation, personal transformation, and a direct connection with the divine, things that the traditional Roman cults, focused on communal well-being and ritual correctness, didn't always provide. As a priest of the old Roman gods, you might have seen these new faiths encroaching, attracting followers, and perhaps even making your own rituals seem staid or irrelevant by comparison. It could lead to a sense of your own tradition being outmoded, your own gods losing their appeal in a changing spiritual landscape. This internal struggle, this navigation between tradition and evolving beliefs, between public performance and private doubt, adds another layer of complexity to the priestly experience. It wasn't just about getting the rituals right. It was about what those rituals meant, both to the priest and to the society they served. In an era of increasing intellectual ferment and spiritual seeking. Finally, as we round out our tour of priestly woes, let's consider the ultimate sucky endgame for many a Roman priest, the decline and fall of traditional Roman paganism itself. For centuries, these priesthoods, these rituals, these gods had been the bedrock of Roman identity and statehood. But as the Roman Empire transformed, and particularly with the rise and eventual triumph of Christianity, the world of the Roman priest was turned upside down. Imagine dedicating your life to serving Jupiter, Mars, or Vesta, meticulously upholding traditions passed down for generations, only to find your gods increasingly dismissed as false idols, your temples shuttered or repurposed, and your sacred rites outlawed. In the early centuries AD, paganism and Christianity coexisted, often uneasily. But as Christianity gained imperial favor, starting with Constantine, the pressure on traditional Roman cults mounted. Imperial edicts began to restrict pagan practices, withdraw funding from temples, and confiscate temple properties. Priests who had once been respected figures of authority found their status diminished, their influence waning. Their sacred knowledge, once vital to the state, was now deemed irrelevant or even dangerously heretical. The psychological impact must have been devastating for those who truly believed. Your entire worldview, your spiritual foundation, the very purpose of your life's work, is being systematically dismantled and declared erroneous. Your gods are being mocked, your traditions vilified. And it wasn't just a gentle fading away. There were periods of active persecution. Pagan priests could face legal penalties, loss of position, or even violence if they resisted the tide of Christianization. Famous pagan senators and intellectuals, like Symmachus, made eloquent pleas for the preservation of ancient Roman religious traditions, arguing for tolerance and the value of ancestral custom. but these were largely rearguard actions against an overwhelming shift in the empire's spiritual and political landscape. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, paganism was effectively suppressed as the dominant state-sponsored religion. The eternal flame of Vesta was extinguished. The oracle of Delphi fell silent. The great temples were closed, converted into churches, or left to fall into ruin. What did this mean for the individual priest? For some, it might have meant a pragmatic conversion to the new faith, a way to survive and perhaps even maintain some measure of influence in the new order. For others, it could have meant quiet defiance, attempting to preserve the old ways in secret, at great personal risk. For many, it probably meant disillusionment, despair, and a sense of profound loss, the end of a world, the death of their gods, the obsolescence of their sacred calling. Their skills in augury, their knowledge of sacrificial rites, their meticulously memorized ancient prayers, all rendered useless, relics of a bygone era. It's a poignant and often overlooked aspect of the fall of Rome. The personal tragedy of those whose identities and lives were inextricably bound up with a religious system that was ultimately swept away by the tides of history. From a position of revered authority to a relic of a condemned faith, that's a long and painful fall from grace, and a truly sucky way to end a priestly career. So, there you have it. Your dream job as a Roman priest? Probably not quite the serene, divinely inspired gig you imagined. More like a high-stakes, high-stress balancing act involving mind-numbing rituals, bizarre personal restrictions that would make a hermit wince, a disturbingly close relationship with animal entrails, precarious finances, and the constant threat of political machinations or public disgrace. And if you manage to navigate all of that, you might just live long enough to see your entire religious system declared obsolete and your gods kicked to the curb. By now, you've probably figured out that the romanticized image of the wise, benevolent Roman priest, effortlessly communing with the gods and guiding the state with serene pronouncements, is, like so many historical cliches, mostly smoke and incense. The reality was far more complex, far more human, and frankly, far more prone to suckage on a grand scale. They were cogs in a vast, ancient machine of state religion, a machine that demanded precision, purity, and often a suspension of disbelief, all while offering a decidedly mixed bag of rewards and a heaping dose of anxiety. Think about the sheer pressure. One misspoken word in a prayer, one ill-omened bird, one diseased liver, and you could be blamed for famine, plague, or military defeat. You're trying to appease a pantheon of gods whose moods seemed as fickle as the Roman mob, all while your political rivals might be sharpening their knives or your temple roof is leaking again. And let's not forget the fashion constraints. Try looking dignified while worrying if the knot in your toga is ritually incorrect, or if your special pointy hat is on straight for 3 days running because you can't take it off. It's a far cry from a quiet life of contemplation. Yet, for all the drudgery, the danger, and the downright weirdness, these individuals were central to the functioning and self-perception of Roman society for centuries. They were the intermediaries, the interpreters, the stage managers of Rome's relationship with the divine, or at least what Rome believed to be the divine. Their story is a potent reminder that even the most sacred roles in history are often filled by ordinary people grappling with extraordinary and frequently unpleasant circumstances. So the next time you see a statue of a Roman priest looking solemn and important, spare a thought for the poor sod. He probably hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks, was worried about the price of sacrificial oxen, and was desperately hoping a dog wouldn't run past his window and ritually contaminate his entire day. It's enough to make you grateful for the separation of church and state, or at least for a job that doesn't require you to predict the future by staring at a sheep's spleen. Thanks for sticking with me on this slightly less than beatific journey. Until next time, try not to annoy any ancient deities. You never know who's still holding a grudge. You never know. And if anyone knew about ancient deities holding a grudge, it was the poor sods whose job it was to try and keep them sweet. The Roman priests. Because tonight, we're not just tiptoeing around the edges of divine displeasure. We're diving headfirst into the gaping maw of ancient Rome's holy horrors. Forget any idyllic notions of serene temple life, communing with benevolent gods, and basking in the warm glow of public adoration. For many who donned the priestly robes, a sacred career was less a pathway to enlightenment and more a one-way ticket to a life filled with killer taboos that would make your head spin. The constant dread of bad omens that could signal your own doom as much as the state's, and a pervasive, soul-crushing misery that the incense smoke and sacrificial wine could never quite mask. We're talking about a job description written in stone, often by people who'd been dead for centuries, with penalties for minor infractions that could range from public humiliation to, well, let's just say you didn't want to mess up if you were a Vestal virgin. This wasn't just about believing in the gods, it was about navigating a minefield of ritual obligations and terrifying prohibitions where one wrong step could bring disaster, not just upon your own head, but upon the entire city of Rome. So, you think your boss is demanding? Imagine having a pantheon of easily offended, often contradictory, supernatural entities as your line managers, with the entire population of Rome as your performance review committee. Yeah, holy horrors just about covers it. This is the story of why blessed was probably the last word many Roman priests would use to describe their working lives. Let's start with the killer taboos, because these weren't just gentle suggestions for a more pious lifestyle. These were ironclad, life-altering, and sometimes utterly baffling restrictions that could turn a priest's existence into a permanent state of high alert. And the undisputed king of killer taboos, the poster boy for priestly inconvenience, was the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter. This poor guy. His life was so hedged in by ancient prohibitions that it's a wonder he could even breathe without ritually offending someone or something. Think of the most random, restrictive rules you can, and the Flamen Dialis probably had them covered, and then some. He couldn't ride a horse. He couldn't even touch a horse. Why? Who knows? The original reasons were lost in the mists of time, but the rule remained, absolute and unyielding. He couldn't touch or even name a dog, a she-goat, ivy, beans, yes, beans, sorry, no chili for Jupiter's main man, or raw meat. Imagine the dinner party anxiety. Is that a bean in the salad? Must flee. He couldn't anoint his body outdoors. His hair and nails, they could only be cut by a free man using a bronze knife, and the clippings, along with the cut hair, had to be meticulously collected and buried under a fruitful tree. Not just any tree, mind you, a fruitful one. The logistical nightmare. He couldn't wear a ring unless it was broken and had no stone. He couldn't have a single knot anywhere on his clothing. His toga had to be fastened with fibulae, not tied. His special pointy hat, the apex, which was basically a leather skull cap with an olive wood spike on top, had to be worn at all times, indoors and out. Imagine trying to sleep in that thing. Or take a bath. He couldn't be away from his own bed for more than 3 nights in a row, which effectively made him a prisoner in Rome, or at least severely limited his travel options. Sorry, can't make the family reunion in Campania, folks. Jupiter needs me within a 3-night radius of my divinely mandated mattress. He wasn't allowed to see people working, especially not armed men or an army, which must have made navigating a city like Rome, with its constant military presence and construction, a daily obstacle course. His wife, the Flaminica Dialis, was similarly shackled by her own set of equally bizarre rules. She had to wear dyed robes, couldn't go up more than 3 steps, unless it was a Greek-style ladder for some obscure reason, and if she heard thunder, the ritual observances were intense. The sheer mental energy required to remember and adhere to this labyrinthine list of prohibitions, day in and day out, must have been exhausting. It wasn't a job, it was a performance art piece in ritual purity, where any slip-up, any accidental contact with a forbidden bean or an unknotted rope could be seen as a grave offense against the chief god of the Roman state, potentially bringing down his wrath upon everyone. Talk about pressure. It's less a holy calling and more a divinely ordained obsessive-compulsive disorder. And the Flamen Dialis wasn't alone in his misery of minutiae, though he was certainly the most extreme case. The Vestal Virgins, those 6 priestesses dedicated to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family, lived under perhaps the most famous and feared taboo of all, the vow of chastity. For 30 years, 10 as a novice, 10 in active service, and 10 as a teacher, they were to remain absolutely, unquestionably virgin. The honor was immense. Vestals were revered, had special privileges, like the right to make a will or to pardon condemned criminals they encountered on the way to execution, and their persons were sacrosanct. But the price for breaking that central vow was a horror show designed to terrify anyone into compliance. If a Vestal was found guilty of incestum, unchastity, the punishment was uniquely gruesome. She was dressed in funeral attire, carried in a closed litter, as if already dead, and then taken to a specially prepared underground chamber. There, she was given a small amount of food and water, a lamp, and then sealed in to die alone in the dark, buried alive. The logic was that her blood, being sacred, could not be spilled by an executioner, and the earth could not be polluted by her unchaste body directly. It was a chillingly bureaucratic solution to a sacred crisis. Her male partner in crime, if identified, was publicly flogged to death in the comitium. The pressure to maintain that vow, under the constant scrutiny of Roman society, for 3 decades, must have been almost unbearable. Every interaction, every glance could be misinterpreted, and the stakes were literally life and death. Not just her own, but symbolically, the purity and safety of Rome itself, as Vesta's sacred flame, which they tended, was tied to the city's fortunes. Other flamens, the priests dedicated to specific deities, also had their share of peculiar restrictions, though usually less comprehensive than those of the Flamen Dialis. The Flamen, Martialis, priest of Mars, couldn't touch things associated with war while in Rome, which, for a priest of the war god, seems counterintuitive, but was likely tied to concepts of ritual separation. The Flamen Quirinalis, priest of Quirinus, had his own set of ancient rules. Some priesthoods required periods of sexual abstinence before performing certain rites. Certain foods were often forbidden, either permanently or temporarily. Specific types of clothing, often archaic and uncomfortable, had to be worn. For example, the Salii, the leaping priests of Mars, performed their ritual dances in ancient warrior attire, including heavy bronze shields and weapons, which must have been exhausting. The Luperci, priests who celebrated the Lupercalia festival, ran mostly naked through the streets, striking women with goatskin thongs. While perhaps not a taboo in the restrictive sense for them, it certainly set them apart and demanded a specific, rather undignified, public performance. The underlying principle of many of these taboos was the maintenance of ritual purity, castitas. The priest was a conduit to the divine, and any pollution, physical, moral, or ritual, could disrupt that connection and anger the gods. But what constituted pollution was often based on ancient, forgotten beliefs, leading to rules that seemed arbitrary and deeply burdensome to those who had to live by them. Your body, your diet, your clothing, your movements, even your words, were not entirely your own. They belonged, in a sense, to the god you served, and any deviation could be catastrophic. It's a life lived on eggshells, where the mundane becomes menacing. Now, let's turn our attention to the delightful world of omens, because if the killer taboos weren't enough to give a Roman priest a permanent anxiety disorder, the business of interpreting divine will certainly would. Roman religion wasn't about dogma or scriptures in the way we might understand them. It was overwhelmingly concerned with discerning the will of the gods and acting accordingly. And how did the gods communicate? Through omens, signs, portents, a whole cosmic vocabulary of often ambiguous and frankly terrifying messages. And you, Mr. Ms. Priest, were the official translator. No pressure. One of the primary methods was augury, primarily involving the observation of birds, their flight patterns, their calls, even what they ate or didn't eat in the case of the sacred chickens. If you were an augur, one of the most prestigious priestly colleges, your job involved spending long, tedious hours in a templum, a ritually defined sacred space, often on a hilltop, just watching and waiting. You'd define a section of the sky, your prospectio, and then meticulously note every avian activity within it. Did an eagle fly from left to right? Good sign, probably. Did a woodpecker tap 3 times? Need to check the ancient manuals on that one. Was it a raven or a crow? The distinctions mattered. The direction, the number of birds, the type of bird, the sounds they made, all of it was fed into a complex, ancient system of interpretation. Imagine the sheer boredom, punctuated by moments of intense stress. You're out there, possibly all night, cold, tired, trying to stay focused, knowing that the decision to launch a military campaign, hold an election, or ratify a treaty could depend on your interpretation of a pigeon's flight path. And what if the birds just weren't playing ball? What if the sky was empty, or the signs were hopelessly confused and contradictory? You couldn't just shrug and say, "Sorry, gods aren't talking today." The state needed an answer. The pressure to find some meaning, any meaning, must have been immense. And of course, this system was ripe for political manipulation. If a powerful consul wanted to delay a vote he was likely to lose, a friendly augur might suddenly find some terribly inauspicious bird activity that necessitated postponing the assembly. Conversely, favourable omens could be discovered to support a favoured policy or candidate. This put augurs in a powerful but also perilous position. If your interpretations consistently favoured one faction, you could make powerful enemies. And if your favourable omen was followed by a catastrophic military defeat, well, your credibility, and possibly your career, was toast. The tools of the augur's trade, like the lituus, a curved staff used to define the templum, were sacred, but the process was fraught with human fallibility and political pressure. It wasn't a clear window into the divine mind. It was more like trying to decipher cosmic Morse code tapped out by easily distracted feathered messengers, all while your political patrons were breathing down your neck. The anxiety of getting it wrong, of misinterpreting a subtle sign, or of being accused of faking it, would have been a constant companion. If birdwatching for the fate of nations wasn't stressful enough, then welcome to the even more visceral and often stomach-churning world of haruspicy, the art of divining the future from the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver. This practice, largely borrowed from the Etruscans, was a crucial part of Roman religious life, especially before important state undertakings. And if you were a haruspex, you were essentially a sacred butcher with a PhD in organ-based prophecy. Picture the scene. A solemn sacrifice is underway. The animal, an ox, a sheep, a pig, has been ritually killed. Its steaming carcass is opened up, and you, the haruspex, are called forward. Your job is to carefully remove and inspect the exter, the vital organs, primarily the liver, but also the lungs, heart, and sometimes the spleen or kidneys. The liver was considered the main event, a kind of cosmic map. You'd be looking for its overall size, color, and texture. Were there any unusual lobes, fissures, or markings? The Etruscans had developed complex models of livers, divided into sections corresponding to different deities or parts of the sky, to aid in interpretation. A blemish or abnormality in a particular section could indicate trouble from that specific god or celestial quarter. Imagine holding that warm, slippery, bloody organ in your hands, the smell of fresh blood and hot viscera filling your nostrils, while a crowd of anxious officials and onlookers watched your every move, waiting for your verdict. Was it a latatio, a favourable omen, or a pestifera, a disastrous one? The pressure was unbelievable. What if the liver was discoloured, shrunken, or showed signs of disease? That was a terrible sign, indicating divine displeasure and potential catastrophe. You had to announce this, knowing it could halt a military campaign, scuttle a political alliance, or throw the entire city into a panic. There are accounts of generals proceeding with battles despite dire warnings from the haruspices, sometimes with disastrous results, further reinforcing the perceived power of the practice, and the folly of ignoring it. Conversely, if the liver was perfect, plump, and healthy-looking, it was a sign of divine approval. But what if it was ambiguous? What if there were some slightly odd features, but nothing overtly terrible? The interpretation then became a delicate art, relying on ancient knowledge, precedent, and no small amount of intuition, or perhaps political savvy. A haruspex who consistently delivered bad news might find himself unpopular, while one who always found favourable signs might be suspected of incompetence or corruption if things went wrong. The sheer physicality of it, the constant proximity to blood and death, combined with the immense responsibility of interpreting these gruesome portents, would have taken a special kind of person. You needed a strong stomach, steady nerves, an encyclopedic knowledge of omen lore, and the ability to project an aura of absolute confidence, even if, privately, you were just staring at a confusing mess of animal guts and hoping you didn't screw it up. It's a long way from a quiet prayer in a peaceful temple. It's divination via autopsy, with the fate of an empire potentially resting on your ability to read a sheep's spleen. The misery of being the divine middleman, the celestial messenger boy, or girl in the case of prophetesses like the Sibyl, cannot be overstated. When the omens were good, when the sacrifices were accepted, when the gods seemed pleased, then yes, the priest might share in a sense of communal relief, and perhaps even a little reflected glory. But when the cosmic news was bad, when the birds flew the wrong way, when the entrails were monstrous, when the sacred chickens turned up their beaks at the consecrated grain, then the priest was the one standing in the firing line, tasked with delivering a message that no one wanted to hear. And in a world that deeply believed in the power of these signs, bad omens weren't just abstract warnings, they were announcements of impending doom, signals of divine fury, and harbingers of real-world disaster. Imagine the scene. A Roman general is about to lead his legions into a crucial battle. The fate of a province, perhaps even Rome itself, hangs in the balance. The priests are summoned to take the auspices. After an agonizing wait, the augur, or haruspex, steps forward, face grim, and announces that the omens are terrible. The gods forbid the attack. The general, eager for glory, his troops already psyched up for battle, is now faced with a terrible choice: defy the gods and risk annihilation, and be blamed for it, or call off the attack and face accusations of cowardice or incompetence, all because some priest said a bird looked shifty or a liver had a funny spot. The priest, in this scenario, becomes the focal point of all that frustration and anxiety. He's not causing the bad omen, but he's the one articulating it, giving it voice and authority. And human nature being what it is, it's often easier to get angry at the messenger than at the distant, invisible source of the message. There are historical accounts of priests being pressured, intimidated, or even harmed for delivering unwelcome prophecies or unfavorable omens. Their personal safety could be at risk if they told powerful people things they didn't want to hear. Moreover, the public reaction to bad omens could be extreme. Panic could sweep through the city. People might refuse to conduct business, soldiers might lose morale, and social order could break down. The priest, as the interpreter of these divine moods, might find himself trying to manage public hysteria, a task for which he was likely ill-equipped. He was a conduit for cosmic dread, and that dread could easily splash back onto him. And what if the priest tried to soften the blow? What if he fudged the interpretation a little, trying to avoid causing panic or angering a powerful patron? Then he risked the wrath of the gods themselves, and if things went wrong anyway, he could be accused of impiety and dereliction of duty. It was a no-win situation. Every pronouncement was a gamble, every interpretation a tightrope walk between divine truth, as he understood it, political reality, and public reaction. This wasn't just about predicting the future. It was about managing fear, navigating power, and trying to survive the often terrifying responsibility of being the one who claimed to speak for the gods, especially when the gods were in a really bad mood. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing misery of ritual exactitude. The Romans believed that the efficacy of their religious rites depended not on sincere feeling or spontaneous devotion, but on the absolutely precise and correct performance of ancient prescribed formulas. This was a religion of orthopraxy, correct practice, rather than orthodoxy, correct belief. Every word, every gesture, every element of a sacrifice or ceremony had to be perfect. If there was any mistake, a misspoken word in a prayer, a priest stumbling during a procession, an animal struggling too much before sacrifice, an ill-omened sound like a dog barking or someone sneezing at the wrong moment, the entire ritual was considered invalid, vitium, and had to be repeated from the beginning. This repetition was called instauratio. Imagine the frustration. You've just spent hours meticulously preparing for and performing a complex, lengthy ceremony. You're tired. You're stressed. The public is watching. And then, right at the climax, a flute player hits a wrong note, or a sacred cake accidentally drops on the ground. Right. You sigh internally, or perhaps audibly, if you're having a particularly bad day. Everyone back to their starting positions. We're doing this all over again. Sometimes, rituals had to be repeated multiple times, for days on end, until they were deemed ritually perfect. The cost, in terms of time, resources, sacrificial animals weren't cheap, and priestly patience must have been enormous. Many of the prayers and liturgical formulas were in archaic Latin, so ancient that even the priests themselves might not have fully understood the meaning of every word. They were reciting them by rote, like sacred incantations, where the sound and order were paramount, not necessarily the comprehension. Think of it like trying to correctly pronounce a complex magical spell from a forgotten language, knowing that the slightest mispronunciation could either render it useless or, worse, unleash some unintended cosmic horror. The mental effort of memorizing these vast quantities of ancient text, and the concentration required to recite them flawlessly under pressure, would have been immense. There were no prayer books or teleprompters for many of these ancient rites. It was all up here, in the priest's head, a fragile vessel for centuries of sacred tradition. And because many Roman rituals were public spectacles, performed in temples, in the forum, or during processions through the city, the priest was constantly under scrutiny. Every citizen was a potential critic, ready to note any deviation from established custom. A priest who frequently messed up rituals would quickly lose credibility and respect. He would be seen as incompetent, perhaps even impious, a weak link in Rome's vital connection to the gods. This obsession with ritual perfection, while intended to ensure divine favor, must have often felt like a recipe for priestly neurosis. It created an environment of constant anxiety, where the fear of making a mistake, of inadvertently polluting a sacred act, loomed large. It was less about spiritual uplift and more about high-stakes, error-intolerant religious project management. This constant public performance and the immense responsibility placed upon priests naturally led to another delightful aspect of their sacred career: the misery of intense public scrutiny and the ever-present danger of becoming a scapegoat. Roman priests weren't just religious functionaries, they were public figures, their lives and actions subject to the constant gaze and judgment of the community. Any perceived failing in their personal conduct, any hint of scandal or impiety, wasn't just a private matter. It could be interpreted as a stain on the priesthood itself, a weakening of its sacred power, and therefore a threat to the Pax Deorum. If a prominent priest was seen to be living extravagantly, or neglecting his duties, or associating with unsavory characters, it wouldn't just damage his own reputation. It could lead to questions about the integrity of the entire religious system. The pressure to maintain an impeccable public facade, to live up to an often impossibly high standard of ritual purity and moral rectitude, must have been relentless. And when things went wrong for the state, a devastating plague, a prolonged famine, a humiliating military defeat, a series of terrifying natural disasters, people needed an explanation. They needed someone to blame. And who better than the individuals whose job it was to keep the gods happy? If Rome was suffering, it must be because the gods were angry. And if the gods were angry, it was almost certainly because the priests had messed up. They had performed the rituals incorrectly, they had misinterpreted the omens, they had allowed some pollution to contaminate the sacred rites, or perhaps their own personal conduct had been so offensive to the gods that divine favor had been withdrawn from the entire community. This made priests incredibly vulnerable, especially in times of crisis. They could become convenient scapegoats for the failures or anxieties of society. Accusations of impiety, neglect of duty, or even witchcraft in later periods could fly. A priest who had made powerful enemies, or who was simply unpopular, might find himself the target of a whispering campaign or even formal charges. The historical record contains instances of priests being punished or removed from office for alleged religious failings, particularly if those failings coincided with periods of public calamity. It was a classic case of shooting the messenger, or rather, blaming the divine intermediary when the divine message, as manifested in worldly events, was unwelcome. This fear of being blamed, of being held personally responsible for events far beyond any individual's control, must have added another layer of profound stress to an already demanding job. You weren't just trying to appease the gods, you were also trying to appease a fickle and often fearful public, a public that could turn on you in an instant if they believed you were the cause of their misfortune. It was a precarious position, suspended between the whims of heaven and the anxieties of earth, with very little room for error and even less for comfort. Compounding all these external pressures and tangible horrors was the potential for a more insidious, internal misery, the gnawing doubt that your entire sacred career, with all its sacrifices and elaborate rituals, might be, well, a bit pointless. While public piety and adherence to state religious forms were expected, the intellectual climate of Rome, especially among the educated elite from which many high-ranking priests were drawn, was far from monolithic. Philosophical schools like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and academic skepticism offered alternative ways of understanding the cosmos, often downplaying or outright rejecting the idea of interventionist, anthropomorphic gods who cared about the precise folding of a toga or the pecking order of sacred chickens. Cicero, himself an augur and a deeply knowledgeable writer on Roman religion, famously has one of the characters in his dialogue on divination systematically dismantle the logical foundations of augury and haruspicy, exposing them as based on superstition and human credulity rather than genuine divine communication. while Cicero himself, in other works, defended the importance of state religion for social cohesion and ancestral tradition. The very existence of such sophisticated critiques suggests that many intelligent Romans harbored private doubts about the literal truth of it all. Imagine being one of these priests, a man of learning, perhaps a senator, a lawyer, a philosopher in your own right, and having to go through the motions of these ancient, often bizarre, rituals day after day. You're meticulously examining a sheep's liver, knowing that your Epicurean friends believe the gods, if they exist at all, are blissfully unconcerned with human affairs. You're chanting archaic prayers to Jupiter, while your Stoic training tells you that true piety lies in virtue and acceptance of fate, not in bargaining with deities through animal sacrifice. The potential for cognitive dissonance, for a profound sense of hypocrisy or futility, must have been immense. You are a pillar of a system that your own reason might be telling you is built on shaky foundations, yet you can't just opt out. The state religion was too deeply interwoven with Roman identity, law, and social order. To openly mock or neglect your priestly duties would be a scandalous act of impiety with severe social and political repercussions. So, you perform the rites, you make the pronouncements, you uphold the facade, perhaps telling yourself it's for the good of the state, for the sake of tradition, or simply because it's your duty and your career. But inside, there might be a quiet hollowness, a sense that you are participating in an elaborate, centuries-old charade. This internal conflict, this struggle between public obligation and private skepticism, would be a unique kind of misery, a lonely burden carried beneath the solemn priestly robes. And as new religious ideas and mystery cults, offering more personal, emotional, and seemingly profound spiritual experiences gained traction in Rome, the traditional state cults, with their formal, civic focus, might have started to feel increasingly anachronistic or spiritually unfulfilling, even to their own priests. And then, for those priests of traditional Roman paganism who endured through the centuries, came the ultimate holy horror, the final crushing misery, the slow, inexorable decline of their entire religious world, and the eventual triumph of a new faith, Christianity, that viewed their gods as demons and their sacred rites as abominations. Imagine dedicating your life, your family's legacy perhaps, to serving Jupiter Optimus Maximus, to tending the flame of Vesta, to interpreting the will of Mars, only to watch as the tides of history turned against everything you held sacred. From the honest century AD onwards, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, often in the face of persecution, but with a persistence and appeal that traditional Roman cults increasingly struggled to match. When Emperor Constantine converted in the early 4th century, the writing was on the wall, imperial patronage shifted. Laws began to be enacted that favored Christianity and restricted pagan practices. Temples lost state funding, their lands were confiscated, their treasures plundered. Priests who had once been respected pillars of the community, advisors to emperors and magistrates, found themselves marginalized, their authority undermined, their very profession becoming suspect. It wasn't just a loss of status. For those who genuinely believed, it was a spiritual catastrophe. Their gods were being overthrown, their sacred spaces desecrated or converted into churches. The ancient rituals, once deemed essential for the survival of Rome, were now forbidden, condemned as superstitious or demonic. Think of the Flamen Dialis, his life meticulously governed by Jupiter's ancient taboos, now told that Jupiter was a false god, a fiction. Think of the Vestal Virgins, their sacred flame extinguished by imperial decree in 391 AD, their centuries-old vigil abruptly ended. The psychological devastation must have been profound. Some priests undoubtedly converted, whether out of sincere belief or pragmatic self-preservation. Others clung to the old ways, perhaps practicing in secret, risking legal penalties and social ostracism. Figures like the Senator Symmachus made eloquent, reasoned pleas for religious tolerance and the preservation of Rome's ancestral traditions, arguing that the ancient rites had protected Rome for centuries and should not be abandoned. But these were voices crying in a wilderness that was rapidly being Christianized. The late 4th and early 5th centuries saw increasingly harsh anti-pagan legislation. Sacrifices were banned, temples were closed or destroyed. Being a pagan priest went from being a prestigious public office to a dangerous, illicit activity. The skills they had honed, the knowledge of augury, the art of haruspicy, the memorized litanies of ancient prayers, were now useless, even incriminating. They were guardians of a dying world, keepers of forgotten gods. It's a tragic end to any career, but for those whose entire identity and purpose were bound up in this sacred tradition, it was a slow, agonizing cultural and spiritual death. From the apex of Roman society to outcasts in their own land, their holy horrors culminated in the ultimate misery of obsolescence and persecution, a final, bitter testament to the impermanence of even the most deeply entrenched religious systems. So, yeah, a sacred career in ancient Rome? Not exactly a walk in the Elysian fields. More like a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers, blindfolded, while juggling flaming torches and reciting archaic legal codes. The killer taboos turned everyday life into an obstacle course of potential divine offense. The constant pressure of interpreting bad omens made you the unwilling bearer of cosmic bad news, with your own reputation and sometimes your safety on the line. And woven through it all was the pervasive misery of public scrutiny, the fear of becoming a scapegoat, the potential for political manipulation, and for some, the gnawing internal doubt about the whole damn enterprise. By now, that romantic image of the serene priest communing peacefully with the gods has probably been thoroughly trampled under the weight of historical reality, much like an unfortunate sacrificial animal. These weren't just abstract difficulties, they were the lived, daily experience for many who served the Roman pantheon. They were the human shock absorbers in Rome's often turbulent relationship with the divine, bearing the brunt of both heavenly displeasure and earthly anxieties. Think about it. Your life dictated by rules you might not understand, performing rituals whose efficacy you might privately question, all while knowing that a single slip-up, a misplaced word, or an uncooperative chicken could brand you an enemy of the state and a pariah before the gods. And the reward for this lifelong tightrope act? If you were lucky, some prestige, maybe a bit of influence. If you were unlucky, you ended up as blame bait for a failed harvest or a lost battle. And if you were really, historically unfortunate, you got to witness your entire religious universe crumble into dust, your gods declared demons, and your sacred knowledge rendered not just obsolete, but actively heretical. It's a potent reminder that even the most revered positions in history often came with a hefty price tag of personal suffering and profound insecurity. These priests, in their own way, were gladiators of the spirit, battling not lions in an arena, but the capricious whims of fate, the anxieties of a superstitious populace, and the often terrifying demands of gods who seemed to specialize in making life difficult. So the next time you stumble upon a depiction of a Roman religious ceremony, look past the solemn robes and the billowing incense. Try to see the sweat on the priest's brow, the flicker of anxiety in his eyes, the weary slump in his shoulders. He wasn't just serving the gods, he was surviving them. And that, my friends, was the unholy truth of his sacred and often profoundly miserable career. He wasn't just serving the gods, he was surviving them. And that, my friends, was the unholy truth of his sacred and often profoundly miserable career. So, if you're still clinging to that postcard image of the Roman priest chilling in some serene temple, draped in spotless white, having a grand old time communing with the divine and dispensing wisdom with a beatific smile, well, bless your innocent heart, but you're going to need to toss that image onto the sacrificial pyre right now, because we're about to dive deep into why being a Roman priest, for many, was less about spiritual bliss and far more about navigating a labyrinth of utterly insane rules, regulations, and restrictions that actively conspired to suck every last drop of spontaneity, personal freedom, and what any sane person would recognize as fun out of their existence. Forget serene temples. Think more like a divinely ordained correctional facility where the wardens were invisible, easily offended, and had a penchant for demanding you don't eat beans or tie knots in your shoelaces. This wasn't a job for the free-spirited. This was a meticulously choreographed, often terrifying, lifelong performance of adherence to ancient, baffling, and profoundly joyless protocols. If you were looking for a good time in ancient Rome, the priesthood was probably the last place you'd sign up, unless your idea of fun involved constant anxiety and an encyclopedic knowledge of things you couldn't do. Let's talk about these insane rules, because they weren't just minor inconveniences. They were the very architecture of a priest's life, shaping their every waking moment, and often their sleeping ones too. And if we're going to talk about insane rules, we have to start with the undisputed heavyweight champion of ritualistic restriction, the gold medalist in divinely mandated discomfort, the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter. This poor bastard. His life wasn't just governed by rules, it was practically mummified in them. Imagine trying to go about your day when you're forbidden from riding a horse, or even touching one. In a society where horses were a primary mode of transport and a symbol of status. Good luck with that. Sorry lads, can't join the victory parade. Jupiter says, no horsey rides for me. And it didn't stop there. He couldn't touch or even name a dog, or a she-goat, or ivy, or beans. Yes, beans, one of the staple foods for many. The Flamen Dialis was living in a constant state of bean avoidance. Raw meat? Couldn't touch it. Couldn't even look at it too closely, probably. His entire diet must have been a logistical nightmare, a carefully curated selection of things that wouldn't send Jupiter into a celestial tantrum. Then there were the personal grooming rules. His hair and nails could only be cut by a free man using a bronze knife. No iron, thank you very much. And the clippings had to be carefully collected and buried under a fruitful tree. Not just any tree, a tree that actually produced fruit. Imagine the search party every time he needed a trim. All right, men, fan out, we need a ritually acceptable barber and an orchard stat. He couldn't wear any ring that was closed or had a stone in it. Only broken rings were permissible. He couldn't have a single knot anywhere on his clothing. His toga was fastened with brooches, not tied. Even his bed had to have its feet smeared with mud. Why? Don't ask. The gods move in mysterious and apparently very muddy ways. His special conical hat, the apex, a rather fetching leather cap topped with an olive-wood spike, had to be on his head at all times. Sleeping, eating, bathing, presumably with some waterproof apex cover we don't know about. That hat was his constant companion. Try to imagine the neck strain. And travel? Forget it. He couldn't be away from his own bed for more than 3 consecutive nights. So, no extended vacations, no diplomatic missions, no just getting away from it all. He was basically under house arrest by divine decree. He couldn't swear an oath. He couldn't even see an army arrayed for battle. In Rome, a city whose entire existence was practically built on military parades and armed conflict, his daily life must have been an elaborate game of ritual twister, constantly contorting himself to avoid breaking one of 1,000 ancient, often inexplicable prohibitions. Fun? The only fun being had was probably by the gods, watching him try to navigate a trip to the Forum without accidentally glimpsing a soldier or stepping on a stray bean. The Flamen Dialis might have been the poster child for priestly suffering by rules, but he wasn't the only one whose life was a tapestry of thou shalt nots. The other major Flamens, priests dedicated to specific gods like Mars, Flamen Martialis, or Quirinus, Flamen Quirinalis, also had their own unique sets of ancient restrictions, though perhaps not quite as encyclopedic as Jupiter's man. The Flamen Martialis, for instance, had rules about what he could or couldn't touch that related to war, but these often involved complex ritual separations of spheres, meaning he couldn't always engage with Mars-like things in a Mars-like way when inside the city, for example. It's like being the priest of rock and roll, but only being allowed to listen to elevator music. Then you have the Vestal Virgins. Revered, yes. Powerful in their own way, absolutely. But fun? Their core job description involved a 30-year vow of absolute chastity. 30 years. In a society where marriage and family were central, and the penalty for breaking that vow? Being buried alive. That's not just a rule. That's a sword of Damocles hanging over your head every single second of every single day for 3 decades. The psychological pressure alone would be enough to crush any sense of youthful frivolity. Their lives were rigidly structured, confined for the most part to the House of the Vestals and the Temple of Vesta. While they had privileges, like prime seats at the games, those fun outings were still part of their public ritual role, not a chance to let their hair down, which, by the way, was probably also subject to specific styling rules. Beyond these high-profile examples, many other priesthoods involved periods of mandatory abstinence from sex, certain foods, or specific activities before or during religious festivals or rituals. Ritual purity was paramount, and purity often meant restriction, denial, and a life lived in careful, controlled opposition to the messier, more spontaneous aspects of human existence. You couldn't just decide on a whim to go to a rowdy tavern, or eat that delicious-looking but ritually questionable sausage, or sleep in because you were tired. Your life was dictated by a divine schedule and a sacred rulebook. Even the clothing was often a source of discomfort and restriction. Archaic robes, heavy headdresses, specific materials that might be itchy or hot, fashion was dictated by ancient tradition, not comfort or personal preference. The Salii, the leaping priests of Mars, had to perform energetic warlike dances clad in ancient armor, carrying heavy bronze shields. Try doing that for hours in the Roman sun and see how much fun you're having. It was a life where your body, your time, and your choices were constantly being constrained by forces beyond your control, all in the name of gods whose requirements often seemed designed to maximize inconvenience. Spontaneity was suspect. Joy, if it wasn't part of a prescribed religious festival, and even then, it was often ritualized joy, was probably frowned upon. This wasn't a recipe for a good time. It was a recipe for a headache, a rash, and a deep-seated resentment of beans. And what about the core business of priesthood, the rituals themselves? Surely there was some profound, uplifting, maybe even fun spiritual experience to be had there. Well, if your idea of fun involves mind-numbing repetition, terrifyingly high stakes, and the constant paralyzing fear of making a tiny mistake that could bring ruin upon yourself and your entire city, then yes, Roman rituals were an absolute blast. For everyone else, they were likely an exercise in tedium and terror. The Romans believed that the gods weren't interested in your heartfelt intentions or your spontaneous expressions of devotion. They were interested in precision. Rituals had to be performed perfectly, according to ancient, often archaic formulas. Every word of every prayer, every gesture, every sacrificial animal, every ritual implement had to be exactly right. If you mispronounced a word in a prayer that was so old, nobody really knew what it meant anymore. Invalid. If you stumbled during a solemn procession, invalid. If a flute player accompanying the sacrifice hit a wrong note, or if the sacrificial victim bellowed at the wrong moment, or if a dog barked inauspiciously nearby, all invalid. The whole damn thing, from start to finish, had to be repeated. This lovely process was called instauratio. And it wasn't uncommon for important state rituals to be instaured multiple times, sometimes for days on end, until the presiding priests were satisfied, or exhausted enough to declare, that it had finally been done perfectly. Imagine the sheer soul-destroying boredom of that. You're leading a public sacrifice. The crowd is watching. The magistrates are tapping their feet, and because some pigeon decided to relieve itself on the altar at the critical juncture, you have to rewind and do the whole 2-hour shebang all over again, and possibly again. Any sense of spiritual connection would likely be ground into dust by the sheer repetitive drudgery. The focus wasn't on communing with the divine, it was on not screwing up the script. It was quality control for the cosmos. And you were the beleaguered factory foreman. And the script was long, complicated, and often written in a version of Latin so ancient it was practically a foreign language, even to the priests. They were memorizing and reciting vast tracts of this stuff, where the sound and order of the words were paramount, not necessarily their easily discernible meaning. It's like trying to assemble IKEA furniture using instructions written in Proto-Indo-European, knowing that if you put tab A into slot B incorrectly, your entire city might be smitten by a plague. The anxiety would be crippling. There was no room for improvisation, no space for personal expression. It was about flawless execution of a preordained, unchangeable routine. Fun doesn't usually thrive in an environment of rigid conformity and high consequence error potential. Roman ritual was serious business, deadly serious, and about as much fun as performing open-heart surgery while reciting the phone book backwards. Then there's the sheer, unadulterated joy of living your entire life under a public microscope, where your every action, your every word, your every perceived misstep could become a matter of public discussion and, potentially, divine concern. Privacy? What's that? As a Roman priest, especially one holding a prominent position, you were a public figure. Your life wasn't entirely your own. You were a symbol, a representative of the state's relationship with the gods, and as such, you were expected to embody a certain standard of behavior, a certain aura of piety and decorum at all times. There was no off-duty priest. You couldn't just clock out from the temple, change into your casual toga, and hit the local wine bar for a raucous night out with your buddies, unless that wine bar was somehow part of a prescribed religious festival, and even then, you'd be watched. Any hint of scandal, any rumor of impropriety, could damage not just your own reputation but also the perceived sanctity of your office and, by extension, the favor of the gods towards Rome. Imagine the pressure. You're at a dinner party, trying to relax, and you have to constantly monitor your conversation, your wine intake, your general demeanor, lest someone report back that the flamen of such and such was seen acting in a manner unbecoming of his sacred role. Your home life wasn't necessarily private either. If you were a Vestal virgin, you lived in the house of the Vestals, a communal dwelling where your every move was known to your fellow priestesses. If you were the Flamandialis, your house was practically a public monument to bizarre restrictions, and you couldn't even leave it for more than 3 nights. Any personal failing, a display of bad temper, a questionable financial dealing, a rumored romantic entanglement, unless you were specifically a priest whose cult involved that, which was rare in the state religion, could be seized upon by your political enemies or by moralizing busybodies. Remember, Roman religion was deeply intertwined with politics. A priest who could be discredited for personal failings was a priest whose religious pronouncements, which could have political implications, could also be undermined. So, you were constantly performing, constantly maintaining a facade of piety and gravitas, even if, behind closed doors, you were just as flawed and human as anyone else. There was no room to be yourself, to make mistakes, to have a bad day in public. The fun of spontaneous, uninhibited self-expression was a luxury most priests simply couldn't afford. Their lives were circumscribed by expectation, by the weight of tradition, and by the ever-watchful eyes of a populace that expected its divine intermediaries to be, if not divine themselves, then at least impeccably well behaved. It's hard to kick back and enjoy life when you feel like you're permanently on stage, and the critics are divine, armed with thunderbolts, and have very exacting standards. And what about those famous Roman feasts? Surely the priests got to enjoy some good food and wine as part of their sacred duties. After all, sacrifices often concluded with a communal meal where the edible parts of the sacrificed animal were consumed. Sounds like a bit of a perk, right? A divinely sanctioned barbecue. Well, hold your horses, or rather, your sacrificial piglets. Even the act of eating and drinking, for a priest, could be hedged about with rules and restrictions that sucked the joy right out of it. First, many priesthoods involved specific dietary taboos. We've already covered the Flamen Dialis and his notorious aversion to beans, raw meat, and a host of other things. But other priests also had foods they were forbidden to eat, either permanently or during specific periods leading up to rituals. These weren't dietary choices for health or personal preference. These were ancient, divinely mandated restrictions. So, while everyone else at the feast might be tucking into a particular delicacy, you, as the officiating priest, might have to abstain, nibbling on your ritually prescribed, and probably less exciting, portion. Then there was the nature of the sacrificial meal itself. While the image of a hearty roast might come to mind, the reality could be more complex. The gods always got their share first. Specific organs or portions burned on the altar. What was left for the humans might not always be the choicest cuts, or it might be prepared in specific, traditional ways that weren't necessarily to everyone's taste. And the sheer volume of sacrificial meat that a prominent priest might be expected to consume or oversee the consumption of during major festivals could be overwhelming. It could become less a joyous feast and more a relentless, obligatory ingestion of sacred protein. Furthermore, the wine flowed freely at many Roman religious festivals, and priests were often expected to partake. But even here, there were rules. Certain types of wine might be prescribed or forbidden, and while a bit of ritual intoxication might have been part of some cults, like that of Bacchus Dionysus, for most state priests, maintaining dignity and control was paramount. Getting embarrassingly drunk at a sacred feast was a definite no-no and could lead to public scandal. So, even the fun of feasting and drinking was tempered by obligation, restriction, and the need to maintain a veneer of priestly decorum. And let's not forget the context. You might be feasting shortly after having been intimately involved in the rather bloody and visceral process of the animal's slaughter and inspection of its entrails. For some, that might put a bit of a damper on the appetite. The fun of a good meal is often in the freedom to choose what you eat, to savour it without a rule book hovering over your shoulder, and to enjoy it in relaxed company. For a Roman priest, even this basic human pleasure was often filtered through a lens of ritual obligation and divine restriction, making it just another part of the job, rather than a genuine source of unfettered enjoyment. Let's not forget the sheer, unadulterated sartorial misery that often came with a Roman priesthood. You think your work uniform is uncomfortable? Try being a Roman priest, where your wardrobe was less about personal style or comfort, and more about ancient tradition, symbolic meaning, and a host of rules that could make getting dressed in the morning a high-stakes ritual in itself. The most iconic, and perhaps most complained about piece of priestly headgear was the apex, worn by the Flamins and some other priests. This was a close-fitting leather skull cap, to which was attached a spike, virgula, of olive wood, often wound with a fillet of white wool. The Flamen Dialis, as we know, had to wear his apex pretty much constantly. Imagine that thing. It wasn't designed for comfort. It probably trapped heat, messed up your hair, if you were allowed to have stylish hair, which was also unlikely, and generally served as a constant, pointy reminder of your sacred and probably itchy obligations. Trying to sleep in it? A recipe for a crick in the neck and a very grumpy priest. Then there were the robes. Priests often wore special togas, usually made of white wool, the toga praetexta, with a purple border, for some, or specific, archaic forms of dress for particular cults. Wool in the Mediterranean heat? Not exactly breathable. And these weren't off-the-rack garments. They had to be ritually pure, often woven in specific ways, and maintained impeccably. A stained or torn priestly robe wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It could be seen as a sign of disrespect to the gods. And remember the Flamen Dialis and his no-knots rule? His toga, and indeed all his garments, had to be fastened with brooches or fibulae, not tied. This might seem like a small thing, but imagine trying to keep a voluminous toga perfectly draped and secured without the benefit of a good, tight knot, especially if you were moving around performing rituals. It would require constant vigilance and probably a lot of fiddly adjustments. Other priests had even more outlandish get-ups. The Sali, the leaping priests of Mars, performed their sacred dances in what was essentially ancient warrior regalia, a short tunic, a bronze breastplate, a helmet, and carrying a sword and the sacred ancilia, figure 8 shields. This wasn't parade armor. They were expected to perform vigorous, physically demanding dances in this heavy, cumbersome outfit. The fun of that, especially during a hot Roman summer, is hard to imagine. The Luperci, who celebrated the Lupercalia, famously ran through the streets clad only in goatskins around their waists. Another outfit, not exactly designed for comfort or dignity, though perhaps fun in a very specific, wild sort of way for those involved, and terrifying for others. The point is, priestly attire was rarely about personal choice or comfort. It was about tradition, symbolism, and adherence to ancient rules. It was another way in which the priest's body was not his own, but an instrument of religious performance. Forget fashion. This was about ritual correctness, and if that meant being hot, itchy, uncomfortable, and looking slightly ridiculous with a spike on your head, then so be it. The gods apparently had very specific, and often very inconvenient, tastes in clerical couture. So, your life is governed by bizarre rules. Your work is repetitive and terrifying. Your food is restricted, and your clothes are uncomfortable. Surely, you could at least enjoy a vibrant Roman social life. Kick back with friends, travel a bit, enjoy the theatre or the games. Well, for many priests, even these simple pleasures were curtailed or complicated by their sacred duties and the rules that came with them. Take the Flamen Dialis again, our favourite example of priestly suffering. His inability to be away from his own bed for more than 3 nights effectively grounded him. No long trips to his country villa, no extended visits to friends in other cities, no participation in military campaigns or diplomatic missions, even if his social standing might otherwise have qualified him. He was a prisoner of his priesthood, tethered to Rome by an invisible, divinely mandated leash. And his rule about not seeing an army, or people working, this must have severely restricted his movements even within the city. He couldn't just take a casual stroll through the forum if a legion was parading, or if major construction was underway. His social circle was likely also limited by the sheer weirdness of his restrictions. Who wants to invite the guy to a dinner party when you have to bean-proof your entire menu and ensure there are no dogs within a 50-foot radius? Other priests, while perhaps not as hamstrung as the Flamen Dialis, still faced social limitations. Their public role meant they were always on. They couldn't simply blend into a crowd at the games or the theatre. Their presence would be noted, their behaviour scrutinised. If they were seen to be too frivolous, too engrossed in worldly pleasures, it could reflect badly on their sacred office. certain priesthoods also had rules about who they could or couldn't associate with. Maintaining ritual purity might mean avoiding contact with people considered impure, such as those in mourning or those who had recently been involved in bloodshed. This could limit their social interactions and create a sense of separation from the everyday life of the community. The Vestal virgins, despite their high status, lived a largely cloistered existence within the house of the Vestals. While they attended public ceremonies and had certain freedoms, their lives were fundamentally separate, defined by their unique vow and their sacred duties. Meaningful, intimate relationships outside their small circle were impossible. Even for priests who were also active politicians, their religious role added another layer of complexity to their social and political maneuvering. They had to be careful not to offend religious sensibilities, even while engaging in the often brutal cut and thrust of Roman politics. Their priestly status could be both a source of influence and of vulnerability. The fun of a relaxed, uninhibited social life, the freedom to choose your friends and your activities without constantly worrying about ritual propriety or public perception, was a luxury many priests simply did not have. Their sacred duties cast a long shadow, circumscribing their personal lives and often isolating them in a bubble of ritual obligation. And let's not forget the ultimate fun killer, the big, overarching reason why being a Roman priest was often more about cynical calculation or fearful compliance than genuine spiritual joy, politics. In Rome, religion wasn't a separate sphere, cordoned off from the messy business of power and governance. It was the messy business of power and governance, or at least an indispensable tool in its arsenal. Many of the most important priesthoods were not filled by dedicated theologians or spiritual seekers, but by ambitious senators and aristocrats who saw a priestly title as another rung on the cursus honorum, another source of prestige, dignitas, and influence, auctoritas. The office of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the state religion, was one of the most powerful positions in Rome, eventually absorbed by the emperors themselves. Being a pontifex, an augur, or a quindecimvir, one of the keepers of the Sibylline books, gave you a say in matters of sacred law, control over the religious calendar, which could be manipulated to advance or obstruct political agendas, and the ability to pronounce on omens, which, as we've seen, could make or break a political career or a military campaign. So, for many of these elite priests, their religious duties were just another facet of their political lives. Fun wasn't part of the equation, power was. They weren't necessarily seeking spiritual enlightenment in the temple. They were seeking an edge in the Senate. This instrumentalization of religion meant that priests were constantly caught up in political intrigue. Your interpretation of an omen might not be based on a genuine reading of divine will, but on what your political faction needed it to be. If your patron was launching a war, you'd better find some auspicious signs, even if the sacred chickens were decidedly off their feed that morning. If your enemy was proposing a law, a timely thunderclap or an ill-omened bird sighting could be incredibly convenient. This turned sacred rites into political theatre, and priests into actors, often delivering lines scripted by their political masters. Any genuine piety or spiritual feeling would be quickly eroded by this cynical manipulation, and it was a dangerous game. If your faction fell from power, your priestly pronouncements could suddenly be reinterpreted as impious or treasonous. If you backed the wrong horse, you could find yourself stripped of your office, exiled, or worse, especially during the brutal civil wars of the late Republic or the paranoid reigns of some emperors. There was no fun in being a pawn in these high-stakes power struggles. Even priests who genuinely tried to remain apolitical and focus on their religious duties could be drawn into the vortex. Their pronouncements, their control over sacred sites or temple treasuries made them valuable assets, and powerful figures would inevitably try to co-opt them. The serene temple ideal was shattered by the constant intrusion of worldly ambition and political expediency. Priestly life wasn't about quiet contemplation. It was about navigating a treacherous landscape where the gods were often just another weapon in the human arsenal of power. And that, my friends, is the antithesis of fun. It's the grim, joyless reality of religion reduced to a tool, and its ministers to reluctant or all too willing operatives. So, when you strip away the incense smoke, the solemn processions, and the grandiose titles, what are you left with when you look at the life of an average, or even not so average, Roman priest? You're left with a life fundamentally defined by an absence of what most of us would consider fun. It was a life corseted by insane rules, from what you could eat to how you could tie your toga, or whether you could even own a dog. It was a life where your primary job involved the mind-numbing, high-stakes repetition of ancient rituals, where a single mistake could bring down divine wrath, or, at least, a great deal of public inconvenience and priestly overtime. It was a life lived under the constant, unforgiving glare of public scrutiny, where your every action was judged, and where you were a prime candidate for scapegoating whenever things went wrong in the state. It was a life where even basic human pleasures like food, social interaction, and comfortable clothing were often subject to bizarre and burdensome restrictions. And overarching all of it was the cynical manipulation of religion for political ends, turning sacred duty into a stressful, dangerous, and ultimately joyless game of power. Forget the serene temples. This was more like a divine obstacle course, designed by a committee of particularly pedantic and easily offended deities. The emphasis was overwhelmingly on restriction, on prohibition, on what not to do, rather than on any kind of expansive, joyful, or spontaneous expression of spirituality. Personal freedom was sacrificed at the altar of ritual purity and state religion. Spontaneity was a sin. Individuality was subsumed by the demands of the office. Where, in all of this, was the room for fun? For laughter that wasn't prescribed? For exploration, for curiosity, for the simple, unburdened enjoyment of being alive? It seems to have been systematically engineered out of the priestly job description. This isn't to say that no Roman priest ever felt a moment of awe or a sense of purpose, or even a grim satisfaction in a ritual perfectly performed. But the pervasive structure of their lives, the sheer weight of tradition and taboo, the constant pressure and scrutiny, all point to an existence that was, for many, far more about endurance than enjoyment. The zero fun hypothesis isn't just a flippant exaggeration. It's a reflection of a system that prioritized external observance over internal experience and conformity over freedom. And that, more than any specific rule about beans or knots, is perhaps the most profoundly joyless aspect of it all. The grand irony, of course, is that these priests, whose lives were so devoid of personal fun and freedom, were responsible for overseeing the religious festivals that were, for the general populace, some of the primary sources of public entertainment and communal joy. The Saturnalia, with its feasting and gift-giving and temporary reversal of social roles, the Lupercalia, with its wild, naked runners, the various games Ludi held in honor of the gods, these were occasions for public revelry, for letting off steam, for a temporary suspension of the everyday grind. And who was making sure these festivals ran according to divine schedule, that the necessary sacrifices were made, that the gods were properly honored so the fun could proceed without incurring celestial displeasure? The priests, of course. They were the stage managers of public enjoyment, the solemn figures ensuring that the sacred framework for communal merrymaking was correctly in place. But were they participating in that joy in the same uninhibited way as the average citizen? Unlikely. Their role, even during festivals, was primarily one of official duty, of maintaining order and propriety, of ensuring the rituals were performed correctly amidst the chaos of public celebration. They were the designated drivers at the cosmic party, making sure everyone else got to have fun safely, or at least in a ritually acceptable manner, while they themselves remained bound by their sacred responsibilities and their often uncomfortable, restrictive roles. Imagine the Flamen Dialis at the Saturnalia. While everyone else is swapping roles with their slaves and generally behaving in a topsy-turvy fashion, he still got to worry about not touching a horse, avoiding beans, and keeping his pointy hat on straight. It's hard to get into the spirit of chaotic abandon when your life is a permanent exercise in meticulous self-regulation. This disconnect between the public experience of religious festivity and the private reality of priestly obligation is perhaps one of the most poignant illustrations of the zero-fun aspect of their careers. They facilitated joy for others, but their own lives were often systematically stripped of it. They were guardians of a tradition that for them was less about ecstatic communion and more about the wearying weight of ancient rules. So, the next time you think of ancient Rome and its vibrant religious life, remember the priests not as serene figures in sun-dappled temples, but as the often stressed-out, rule-bound, and probably deeply unfun functionaries who kept the whole elaborate, creaking, and occasionally terrifying machine of state religion trundling along. Theirs was a sacrifice of a different kind, not of animals on an altar, but of personal freedom and simple human enjoyment on the altar of divine expectation and societal demand. And that, in its own quiet way, is a tragedy far removed from the boisterous fun of a Roman holiday.